So you're holding my first book, and we're going to talk about the book today. This is Sara Lomax. She is the owner, founder. How do you title yourself?
Owner and president and CEO of WURD Radio, which is a Black Talk radio station.
Yeah. So if you don't know WRD,
yes, it is Philadelphia. It's 900 AM and 96.1 FM. But we also have an app, so you can listen to it digitally. We're trying to get your demographic to listen. Trying to get younger folks to listen.
To come on board.
And
so I invited Sara her background is in journalism, and she's a woman in business with such a fantastic life, to talk about my life, which is about 30% of the book. So 70% of the book is reflections on the first company that I built, which went on to become the first Black-owned B Corp in North America in the fashion space. And the first 30% is what happened in my early life that opened up my aperture for thinking about the function that business has to serve, and work in parallel with government agencies and nonprofit agencies to really address public suffering, human suffering, and the planet. So it's a guide that starts in a very personal journey.
So Kimberly.
So Sara.
Why did you write this book now?
I wrote it because I think it became very clear for me that one of the reasons why Black folks in particular, broader audiences in general, Americans, the global economy, haven't thought about the potential for business is because we haven't been given an explicit guide for how to expand the notions of what function business is supposed to serve. So I saw it so much as like, I didn't go to Wharton, I don't have an MBA, and yet I was able to raise $500,000 and build a really, I think arguably it's a noteworthy brand. And I did that the long, hard way. And given the state of the planet and given the extent of the suffering that we're all observing, we just don't have a whole lot of time to spend another 5 or 6 years individually trying to figure out how do we crack systems to build things that are bold. And so this is just like here's this almost decade of experience distilled into, digestible lessons. Now let's all get to the front line and let's figure out how we can use entrepreneurship and even business leadership to drive the change that no one else is going to produce for us.
A lot of times, because this book is very personal, as well as all the things you just said in terms of, providing a roadmap and a guide and very practical takeaways. But you also really zero in on your early childhood, your personal journey, and how that informs, the way you approach your entrepreneurship and your career. And you had a rough, you had a great childhood until about 12, and then it kind of, fell apart. And I want you to talk about that because it's such a central piece of the book. But the thing that I loved about it, because I've read a lot, and I think all of us have read kind of autobiographical books. And what I love about this book is you are so graceful and so kind to your parents, to your people who really disappointed you. They imprinted on you like some really challenging things. But instead of you using that as a crutch or as a way to kind of work out your stuff on them, you look at them with so much humanity and kindness. And I loved that. I actually was talking to my mom about this because we have people in our sphere who've written books, and we're like, oh, damn,
they went in.
They said that about their mom, and it's hurtful.
It is hurtful.
And so I just wanted to say how much I noticed that. So much care, so much love, despite the devastation that it had on your life. So that's my big wind up for you to talk a little bit about that early part of your life and how you arrive to process it in such a constructive way that it's also fueled your work.
I'm so grateful that was your takeaway, because that was actually the hardest part of producing this book. Because, you know, in the longer form, I think like a lot of us, our parents, it gets complicated, and there are moments when they fall short of what we need in a moment. And it took me 9 years of therapy to be able to really recognize that before they were my parents, they were individuals. And that everything that our parents bring to the way they approach parenting us is informed by the people they were before we arrived in their journeys. And I also knew that one of my number one rules is to try to honor my mother and my father. Mm-hmm. That's like a driving force for how I produced this book, was thinking about not wanting to stray away from that. I gave it to my mom first before I published it, and it was hard, and it's still hard. And it's something I think it'll take some time and some other portals for us to continue to figure out how to pursue repair, which is something we always, I think, are working through with our parents sometimes. In relationships, there's harm and there's repair. And my dad, I talked to him 3 days ago, and he said, I went to the bookstore and I ordered a copy, and I was like, I'm so glad, because then they'll know they need to carry it. And wanting to show the deference that I have for what they had to endure before I showed up, and not wanting to stay in a space of unforgiveness or lack of grace.
So talk a little bit about, for people who haven't read the book, what transpired?
Yeah, my parents were, they came into a moment in American culture where Sesame Street was on TV, and where integration had allowed Black folk to enter into the middle class and to join the postal service. The real easiest pathway to the middle class for Black people. And my childhood showed me the precarity of the middle class for Black people. And they used that income to buy a house. They used that income, a beautiful home with a really generous outdoor space. My father was a gardener. I learned so much about the lessons of gardening and the metaphor it is for life through what he did. And then by the time I was about 12, my mother had some personal challenges, and her response to her personal challenges were to leave our family. And so with very little notice to any of us, one day she was there and one day she was gone. And then my dad was really working hard to figure out how to save that. The house, it was a huge house, huge heating bills, and he drowned in depression. And he discovered what a lot of Black folks, particularly in Milwaukee in that moment, were discovering by intentional placement: crack cocaine. And so while my mom was physically gone, my dad really tried to be physically present, but his addiction became his priority. Yeah. And so that became two parts of my life: knowing what it's like to live in a house that we owned with a library and cherry trees and lavender and lilac bushes, to not having running water, to not having a washing machine that worked, to, really having to navigate, poverty. And because of that, it forced me to consider things that were not necessarily aligned with my highest sense of morality, but my sense of desperation. And that led me to think about and to do things that were criminal, and that by the grace of my language is God, I was protected from the criminal system. But I understand how so many people out of their poverty land up arrested, and I understand the implications of that. Well of creativity. Absolutely. When there wasn't resources, it was a deep well of creativity that we sometimes weren't even conditioned to see, the expression of love that was seeking to be transmuted through the things that were created and given to us. And I think that for me, that's one thing that I choose to hold on to, and I have to remind myself of even now, about where people can give and where they can't give and how they can give. And that dress is one of the, I wish I had it. It was one of the things that was lost in the fire of just like that childhood moment, but it remains in my memory as one of the most remarkable and tender things that I think my mother ever did for me.
I love that. I love that. And I'm going to get off this idea of sewing, but I also remember my mother used to make our stuffed animals, and she made like a brown Raggedy Ann for me, and like these big brown Raggedy Ann dolls that she made with her dark stockings. So for the skin.
Wow.
So
when you couldn't get them.
When you couldn't get them.
When you couldn't
get that. Not in the 70s.
No, no.
But you talk a lot about, you had this fractured childhood that really upended your youth, but there were these women who entered your life that really made this profound imprint that kind of steered you. So there was Tamara, your friend, Umi. I want you to talk about Umi and Tamara, and then these teachers in school that saw your brilliance and saw your creativity even when you weren't showing up all the time. So talk about that like tribe of women.
Yeah, I think so much about all the kids who barely graduate and how close they are to really taking a leap that will change their entire stories. I barely graduated from high school. I graduated with like a 2.0. I had to go to summer school to make up credits because I missed so much school. When in the absence of parents, it meant that in my senior year, I was out of school for a solid 3 weeks. Like a solid 3 weeks, I had taken a Greyhound bus to the middle of nowhere, Kansas. And yet I came back, and my teachers, these women, they were always ready to receive what I could bring. And that's another thing that created a sense of grace, was having a memory of women, people who were always willing to make space even when I had fallen short or had been absent. And those women were, Umi was one of them. Umi she was a child of the 70s from Tennessee, so very Southern, like a lot of folks in the Midwest are, very Southern. And my Umi would always show me that she was the first person to introduce me to Nikki Giovanni. Her impression on me in the absence of my mother was a sense of Black womanhood that was liberated from notions of whiteness as the desired aesthetic. That's a massive thing. The day when a Black woman realizes that aspiring to white womanhood is not the pinnacle of success is a moment of that's where we become our Wonder Women. That's when we become free, and that's what Umi gave me. And Tamara was her daughter, which is how I met her. And they were the family that took me in when my parents left. And I talk to them both all the time. Umi's still Umi. She's so proud of this project. And Tamara and I, our lives are so, in some ways, they became so different. She stayed in Milwaukee, and our journeys just worked out in different ways. But the love she has for me transcends the differences, and the love that I have for her transcends the distances.
So you write about this friend of yours in college named Carrie Ann.
Oh Lord.
So
yeah,
Kimberly, you go to Louisiana State.
Yep, I leave
University.
Milwaukee and go to Louisiana State.
She goes to Louisiana State University, and one of you befriend, or this woman befriends with this white woman.
She's just my
Southern
roommate.
Woman. Your roommate.
I don't even get to choose her.
Okay. Her name's Carrie Ann, and she's like a straight up racist. She used the N-word like on the regular with her.
Yeah.
But then, so this, and I want you to speak to it, this speaks to the complexity of lived experience and relationships that are not easily defined by racial categorization. And I think that as hard as it is in this moment where, the Trump administration is just exhibiting such hatred and hostility for Black and brown and anything other than white males' dominance, it's hard to see the individual humanity in these things. So talk about your roommate, Carrie Ann, and how her family
took you in,
and they were straight up racist too.
They were straight up racist. And it's so interesting that the ways in which we can make exceptions for people They lived in a small town called Picayune, Mississippi, very small town. And when I couldn't go home to Milwaukee, because there really wasn't in some ways a clear home to go home to, and I didn't have the means to buy the plane ticket or the train ticket to get home, her family, ironically, they took me in. So when I didn't have a place to go, Carrie Ann would say, first of all, I should say she fed me all the time. Like our fridge was stocked because she had two fathers. Her gay fathers.
I had to read. I was reading it, and I was like, I don't understand.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, dang.
Yes, the plot thickens.
The plot thickens. So Carrie Ann is a white Southern racist with two dads.
With two dads.
Interesting.
And very interesting. And I should say but I always felt love there. I always felt seen there. I always felt included. I was treated like everybody. There was no difference in my treatment. But when I wasn't there was when I was made most aware of the racism that was so normalized in their community and in their family dynamic. And it showed me a lot, I think, about where love can come from, how the universe how God can send love in unusual places. In a moment where I would have been otherwise very much so alone, her fathers became father figures for me. And it changed my proximity to the plight of gay folk. Because they loved me and I loved them, and it just changed how I saw the need to really stand in solidarity with that community. They were no longer like over there. They were my parents in a way. In a way, it was I spent Thanksgiving there and New Year's Eve there. I spent holidays in a home with two gay white dads in the middle of nowhere, Mississippi.
Again, another parallel, because I grew up in Bucks County, which in an area that was Trump country before there was a definition of Trump country. I was the only Black child in my elementary school, my public elementary school. This was in the 70s. And I felt a lot of, so our generation we are the first post-integration generation. And so even though we weren't in the 60s, we were living the progress of the 60s. So I have had to do a lot of my own work because my narrative was that there was all of this racial hostility, and there was. You're a good one was the narrative. But as I've gotten older, I've had to really realize that I also had a lot of love and protection from those same people, one-on-one. So it wasn't this
monolith. It's not a single story.
It's not a single story.
It's not a single story.
It's
complicated.
It's complicated because they were straight up racist. They were definitely racist. But I had real relationships, and they took care of me.
And I will say, for me, even in the work that I'm doing, and I continue to drive what I believe is true, which is removing what I call the spirit of whiteness, removing the spirit of greed and hatefulness from a single story of white people, because I've been so loved by white people who too were rejecting that spirit of domination, of oppression, of suppression, of abuse, because my life has been so consistently dotted with the affirmation and kindness of white folks who were not interested in that, who didn't hold that in their interactions with me. It's continued to allow me to try to figure out how to move towards meaningful integration. If I hadn't had that, I understand the philosophies of separatists. Yeah. I understand the thinking of for people who have only had negative interactions or with white folks, who have only had distance from white folks and haven't had loving relationships with white people. I understand their reluctance to believing that it's possible. That just hasn't been my life.
Yeah.
My life has been one where my parents taught me, my Umi taught me about the realities of the challenges that Black people had faced and were facing, this entire narrative arc. And it was populated by teachers, radical teachers, guidance counselors, professors, my roommates' parents, women who people who were white, who consistently they understood my spirit and they never sought to quench it. And they watered the soil of my mind, and they gave light to my spirit.
So I'm gonna pivot because I'm wondering when you wrote this, because the reality that we're living right now is unlike any other moment in my lifetime. I'm sure in all of our lifetimes. So when did you write this? Because there's a passage here about the relationship with white women, and I know that as a Black woman, I have embraced the philosophy of like, y'all created this shit.
It's on you.
It's on you. Figure it out.
Yeah.
Y'all turned your back. 43% of white women voted for this fool, even with the overturn of Roe v. Wade, even with the criminalization of, and the weaponization of
Of gender.
Y'all created this. And so as I was reading, and I want you to talk about this passage that you have towards the end of the book about your relationship with white women. But as I was reading it, I was like, when did she write this?
As I look, it's very much so like it was a fervor. It was like getting up early, working with a writing partner. Okay, this is what I come up with. What do you think? It was 2 years starting in 2000, in the late part of 2022. And so, it's interesting that it was working.
A long time ago. Right. Black Lives Matter.
Well, but no. My creative process has never really been in relationship with what was happening in the world. It's been in relationship with what I'm processing and what I want to advance. There's a huge protest going on right now today. I wasn't even conscious of the protest, not because I'm not interested in protest or mass demonstration. It's because this is what we do every day. Like we talked about this earlier, we're always in a state of thinking about this. So this work came as I was synthesizing the hardship of building Grant Boulevard and really my frustration that in the first company that I built that was so radical, thinking about living wages, paying living wages from the first day, all of my employees, up to 15 people on payroll at times, taking care of, thinking about women who come home from prison, people weren't really checking for me. And that was it was like, why do we not understand that the businesses that are doing the most good deserve our loyalty? And so this was really actually it was a synthesis of the hardship of being a woman in business.
So I'm not even gonna go into that quote because we talked about that complexity, and we need to move into your work, your businesses, because I mean, how fascinating that you are looking at fashion, the environment, living wages, again, in this current environment of tariffs, which are going to clobber businesses in terms of being able to give living wages and all of those things. But I'm curious, talk about Books Not Bars, how you began to bring together your, work around fashion and your work around formerly incarcerated or incarcerated people and living wage and synthesizing all of that, which is amazing. It's amazing work.
I started that in 2017. So while this book comes so much later, before George Floyd was murdered, before the pandemic, I had already started looking at what was happening I felt like I left America in 2016 and went to Kenya, to Nairobi by myself for the first time. So that idea of being a woman in the world and in East Africa alone, it allowed me to move from my understanding of what I'd been teaching about American history and American literature and to see it from a global lens and to observe from a different distance the intersection of human encroachment and human abuse on the natural world. So I come back from that trip and now I can see that, one, we need intersectional solutions. The things that are happening to the planet have to be addressed in the same way we need to address the needs of people. But I come back and then I watch 13th. So now I have this thinking of there's a concept in my mind that we can approach this from an intersectional design philosophy. And then I watch 13th and it zooms me back in all the way to the floorboards of American culture, which is what's happening to Black folk, brown folk, particularly Black women, because of this history of American slavery and its vestiges in mass incarceration. My design thinking was, if I was going to do something to advance democracy, even as someone who didn't identify as a patriot, it needed to live in those cracks. It needed to live in how do we work through the people who are most first to be forgotten, most to be abused. And when I wanted to plant my work there, It was women who were either currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. So my work and my own activism prior to this book as a work of activism was in getting into prisons and getting into halfway houses and being in community with folks who had been incarcerated and listening, and then having them deem me an activist, and then leveraging my activism to find an economic solution, and not being dissuaded when someone said, wait, you want to tackle mass incarceration and poverty and environmental crisis, you should just choose. And then I said, yeah, because time is short. It wasn't a matter of like, was it going to be hard or easy? It was a matter of the simple urgency of the now. And the urgency of the now is not these siloed solutions. It's multifaceted, it's interorganizational, and it has to address more than one issue. So Grant Boulevard as a business used fashion design and really only because I thought I was stylish. You're one guy, I didn't know that. Still can't sew.
But explain what Grant Boulevard is.
Yeah, so Grant Boulevard it began as a fashion brand interested in making workwear for women prior to the pandemic. And we were cutting and sewing, we were procuring all of our fabric, we were doing all of our grading, all of our patterning, picking up all of our notions. We ran fashion design in Philadelphia for 7 years, all cut and sewn right here, always paying a living wage to our creative teams. And then in 2019, for the first time, we piloted working with women who'd come home from prison in collaboration with the OIC to teach them how to sew, trying to set up a pathway to living wage work. We put that on pause because of the pandemic and picked it back up in 2023 in partnership with the Philadelphia Skills Initiative. And we ran 2 concentric cohorts of working with women who'd come home from prison and just creating a safe space. Like teaching yoga exposures and financial literacy and self-massage and, all of these different healing approaches to building healthier lives. And that's what we did in that first project.
And so there's a lot of, like we said at the outset, practical advice around how you, get capital, how you build a business, how you do that. But then kind of the breakthrough was this fashion, the future forward. So talk about that, because that, again, put all these pieces together.
That was the first time that the Department of Commerce partnered with a small brand, a small business, to experiment with supporting women who'd come home from prison. And so because we had arranged the pieces and there was this growing evidence of stamina about the driving kind of like pool of what Grant Boulevard aspired to do, we were able to find a nonprofit partner that said, we will give these skills that folks need, that we all quietly develop to be able to be in work environments successfully. We'll give that piece if you teach the sewing. And then let's see if we can put these pieces together to create a sustainable employment opportunity for this community of women. And so we were able to raise, just with that one activation, to fund that experiment, $250,000, just to fund the experiment. And I think a lot about the ways in which small business ownership, entrepreneurship, it requires capital for research and development. And I think so much, particularly for Black and brown people who have been dispossessed of traditional pathways to even experimenting with an entrepreneurship, in that journey, we need that capital to try. We need that capital to figure out, how do we turn the lights on? How do we build community? How do we hire people? How do we retain talent? And the Department of Commerce just helped with the training piece, right? Which is really about a restorative healing practice tied to the creative economy. Mm-hmm.
So, and you talk a lot. That's amazing.
Thank you.
It's really like, we had a. I'm serious. I'm imagining I can push a button on the radio and there's like applause. But no, that's
it's
amazing.
I'm very
you go, girl.
Thank you. We did it, y'all.
You did it. But what you also talk about in this book, which is so true, and it's my lived experience too, not to keep piggybacking on your journey, but
it's a human journey.
It is so hard to be a Black woman entrepreneur because, and you say this, people of color, particularly women of color, lack the contacts who can give us warm introduction to people able to invest in us. This is made painfully obvious by how infrequently they choose to invest in Black women. And I don't think that you can underrepresent how critical those relationships are. Like I did a year at Stanford last year. I did a fellowship, a journalism fellowship there, and I took one class at the Stanford School of Business. And that's, Stanford is where Silicon Valley is, okay? All of those people are being groomed to
lead the tech world.
To lead the tech world, to lead the business world, and they are making those relationships in those. And I was in this class. It was called Managing Growing Enterprises. There was not one African American in that room except for me, and they had me sitting in the back in like the timeout chair because I was like auditing the class. There were some Africans, lots of Asians, some South Asians. Lots of white folks, but no African Americans. And this social capital, it's not even an intangible. It is what allows you to kind of get to the front of the line quicker.
It is the fast pass.
It's the fast pass.
It's the fast pass at Disney World. Your network is the ways it accelerates how quickly you can even navigate the apparatus of a city. Because the reality is that the wealth and the connections that are required to drive change they're very concentrated in every city. And once you get access to that elevator, once you recognize there's a room, then you recognize that in the back corner of the room, there's an elevator. Then you get to the elevator and you get into the first floor. And then you realize that once you get to that floor, there's another floor. And then you realize that in every room, it's the same people. And so that social capital and those connections, what they create is a sense of the lubrication of trust, where it's like, I'm going to introduce you to her, and because I introduce you to her, now you're pre-vetted.
You're vetted. Yep.
You're pre-vetted. And when we don't have that pre-vetting, it means that every time we walk into the room, we're the stranger.
And
right?
and you overlay that with the presumption of ineptness because
Absolutely.
we are Black and we are female.
Absolutely.
There's a presumption of, she's not really ready for prime time.
And I'm gonna tell you this, my frustration with Grant Boulevard as a project, it ran into an eventual wall, not because I didn't believe in any of the things everything that I believed in when I built Grant Boulevard is it's in the soil of my consciousness. It cannot be removed. But I also recognize that the great effort to drive living wage work powered by Black women would require a luxury price point. And because we as an American culture don't believe in living wages, we all want them, but we can't afford to pay them. It meant that it was never going to be seen as attractive to even when I could meet, and I know those billionaires. That project the viability of that product is very limited, not just because it's a consumer good, not just because it's in fashion, because ultimately people don't believe that things produced by Black women have the worth that I would need to assign to it. And so it just meant that for me in that project, I could tell that now wasn't the time. And I learned a lot about how to build a business that I'm like, you could put me in the room with those MBAs from Stanford, and I'm like, I'm good. We're the same. I've earned it.
But the arrogance,
yeah.
I mean, I was just like, the arrogance was just unbelievable.
Because the way that culture assigns so much value to the MBA from those programs. And that's why I see the importance of a book like Build It Boldly.
Yeah.
Because as a Black woman, my perch for understanding the economy and American culture is very unique. That's not specific to me as a Black woman. It is a positioning as a Black woman in general. Because of the ways in which we have marginalized, there's one way to think that we've been stuck in the corner, but I think we've been stuck on near the ceiling, where we have an aerial view of the whole thing.
Yep.
This book takes an aerial view based on my intersectional identity on the whole thing. And it says, now here is the cheat code for how to do this in 10 years, recognizing I'm telling you what you're looking at from up there. So if you need to see as an entrepreneur, as a business leader, the apparatus, I've navigated it in Milwaukee, in the Midwest. I've seen it in the South. I've navigated it from the corner of these rooms and building this, raising this money and learning where the heartache is and where the hardship is. And we all got to get to that front line now. So this book aspires to help every person who's thinking about entrepreneurship or consumption, just being a consumer, to be more thoughtful about who we're shopping with, understanding the power that business has to drive change.
So I have 3 more questions.
Mm-hmm.
What's the status of your business right now?
Yeah. Oh, so many things. So I've worked for 7 years hoping that one day Vogue would be like, what you're doing is amazing. We want to tell this story. And they didn't show up for that project, but they showed up last week for Black Ivy Thrift, which is not in this book, but which is another project which might be related to another book. Black Ivy Thrift was my second business, and it was interested in the cultural preservation of the artifacts of the civil rights movement. And so Vogue came 2 weeks ago, and they just did their first feature on Black Ivy Thrift. And the beautiful thing about being signed off on by Vogue is it establishes your credibility in the fashion space in a different way. So that project is going to be moving into a traveling exhibit. I'm really excited to figure out how do we tell a story that feels accessible and digestible about the sacrifices and contributions Black folks have made to American culture through the lens of fashion by a museum exhibit that people can show up to see in Atlanta and Chicago and New York.
And Philly.
And in Philly, yeah, and in Philly, that introduces us differently to the ways in which we have contributed to the preservation of this experiment in democracy, just through our style, through our creative practice. So that's what's happening with that company. And Grant Boulevard moved into a new story of community around women. One of the things I learned about business in this moment is that they drive forward through relationships. Your business really has to be anchored in the ways in which you're able to bring people together into community. And that's one of the things I'm working on in a new distillation of the ethos of Grant Boulevard, which is, it's called Noor by Grant Boulevard. And Noor is the Arabic word for the light. And so it seeks to bring diverse women into proximity with each other and to allow more women to be able to have access to the network that I've built so that we can inwardly create our own warm introductions. So we've been running it through some really intimate dinner series and morning coffee meetups, and we're gonna move into the film screenings, just ways of building community with women so that I can continue to influence how we think about the work that we have to do with each other.
And what about future fashion forward?
It is gonna be distilled for some lessons, but I don't know how that will manifest in the time ahead. I haven't decided yet.
So has the grant expired?
The grant was a one-time grant.
It was a one-time
grant. So now we're going to have to distill what the lessons were to figure out how to learn and how to approach the next stage of research and development and solidarity and progress. So, yeah.
Okay.
It seems like you mentioned this briefly, but you kind of entered into it through fashion, but it's applicable, it's more broadly applicable to anybody starting their business.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yes.
That's the feedback I've gotten.
Okay.
That's the feedback I've gotten. The book has, it's done really well in a lot of ways. We broke into the top 1% on Amazon at one point and won our first book award in nonfiction. And I think it's because it is I feel like I really was trying to be very careful about being honest about the things that are hard and true, because that is, a good teacher makes you feel safe.
Right.
And so, and the hope is that a lot of readers come to this, whether they are leading an industry or they're thinking about, pioneering an industry,
right,
with a sense of this is safe.
Yeah.
And then once you, as a teacher, once you get people into a position of feeling safe, then they can actually learn. Right. Without safety, we don't learn. So the ambition was, how can we make this a safe point of entry for people regardless of gender identities, racial identities, religious, spiritual philosophies. Right. And I have those things, and there were parts I pulled back on to create an entryway that would feel like it sought to extend a hand to everyone. Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The first several collections of Grant Boulevard, there's a fancy language in fashion called zero waste. But it was soul food. We were taking existing garments.
Chitlins.
We were taking existing garments, and we were giving them second and third and fourth lives. We were taking those scraps and turning them into other things. We were taking other brands' trash, and we were turning it into new things. So instead of going out and being like, oh, we want any color we want and any pattern we want, we used a soul food approach. We took what we could get that was salvaged for the sake of reducing our environmental footprint, and that was the story of the collection, right? And then that became Rebirth, which was an all-white collection that we did in 2020. That Rebirth collection was all made from reclaimed fabrics, all white, right? And so I think that's an African-American skill, right? That's an African, the way we do that is not the way they do it in Ghana, the way they do it in South Africa, the way they do it in the Zambia. It is an African-American way. And that for me is a particular point of pride, right? And so I also, while I don't want to seek distance from Africa, I don't want to dilute what our people's experience has been, which is different from theirs. Mm-hmm.
And there is incredible brilliance and creativity in our experience, which I think has to be celebrated and uplifted all the time, because there's such a narrative around, especially now, that we are not contributing anything. We never did. We've just been basically a drain, and so we must celebrate and embrace our brilliance and our exceptionalism.
And people ask sometimes about imposter syndrome.
Yes.
Right? And for me, I continue to evolve even in my notion of that, recognizing that the identity that is true for me is the one that I give myself, right? So I am an imposter if I tell myself, if my language to myself is that I don't belong. But if I say I'm a poet, then I'm a poet. If I say that I'm a painter, then I'm a painter. If I say that I am what I qualify myself. And I think one of the next levels of freedom for Black folk is in our ability to qualify ourselves.
Yeah, yes. Ashe, 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 girl. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a great clip. That's going to be a great clip.
I don't know.
I think that I think you said this earlier, Kimberly, this is a moment of awakening.
Yeah.
Because I do think that in the last election, there was a cohort in our community, not just young people, but all generations, that tapped out.
Yeah.
That didn't feel like, and I think that goes back to us just not feeling empowered, and in real, honesty, the Democrats, the lived experience of so many Black people has not changed under any of these regimes.
Right.
And so it's but now we know that this false equivalency is not true.
Right.
That, Democrats, Republicans, they're all the same. Well, no.
And I hope
quite.
We also continue to hold the line with demanding more of the
absolutely.
People who we do. I hope we vote and we demand more of the candidates that we vote for, because the Democratic Party fell into the state of whatever this toxic stew is because of the ways in which we elected people who really weren't about that life.
Yep.
Because when I look at the Democratic Party, I do see people, I'm a lifelong Democrat, vote every election. They call me a super voter. I see people and I'm like, you are a problem in a blue suit. And and we have to have a better filter for taking off that suit and seeing who the real emperor is.
Yeah.
You are Dr. Kimberly McGlonn. You have a PhD in education. Mm-hmm. You were a teacher for 20 years.
Yeah.
So we haven't talked at all about that. And I just want to see if you can speak a little bit about that part of your journey and how that, because that's kind of like the middle part, your childhood, this career, and then this entrepreneurship journey. Mm-hmm. So talk about that being a little bit of the connective tissue.
I taught a course in colonialism in a predominantly white school district for 18 years, 10 of which I was the chair of the department and the only person of color on faculty. Ain't that something? And in my course in this department, in this course in colonialism, I team taught, this is why I believe in diverse coalition. I team taught with invariably white women. And together we were able to explore, why did colonialism happen? Where did European countries go? What did they leave? What did they take? What were these places like? Afghanistan, India, Rwanda, South Africa, the Gambia, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, before Europeans arrived. And that teaching practice, it really set up, I think, so much of how I understand the way that we are all just global neighbors. And it inspires how I think about leadership in general. And it also fuels my desire to continue to teach. So, while Grant Boulevard as a business effort was a classroom for my learning, I think what happens next is where I'm looking forward to becoming a teacher on a much larger scale and moving from a classroom of 50 freshman students into rooms of 500, 5,000, 500,000 people who are thinking differently about how we respond to every legacy that this Trump administration is going to give us. Because even in this fire, there's going to be a massive opportunity to build something that shows up differently for the survival of the human species, beyond just the survival of this experiment in democracy. And I'm excited to leverage all of those pedagogies and what I learned about what it means to design anything from a classroom to an outfit, to designing, I hope, what will be the seeds of a movement to really change the way that we think about the role of business.
Chapter 10, Preserving Your Body, Protecting Your Mind is the title. You say, grief, stress, anxiety, and what can feel like crippling isolation are an inescapable part of the landscape of your life as a leader. Yeah. 100%. 100%. But then you go on to talk about rest. You have this analogy around surfing and how do you rest? How do you restore?
For me, it's anchored in the 3-prong approach to that pursuit. It is seeking silence, it is seeking solitude, and it is seeking stillness. And that trifecta, for me, it can happen. I can travel to that place in a room full of people because I've developed in my mind the visualization that takes me to a place of spaciousness. And in that way, I can be present where I am, and I can allow myself to step away wherever I am at the same time. That's one thing. The pursuit of rest it doesn't always live in like the plane ticket to the faraway place. It's in the practice I've cultivated in my mind to carve out walls and distance from a moment. And I was talking to my daughter yesterday, and she was saying how if she ever couldn't leave our house to run, then she would just go crazy. And I'm like, no, baby, you have to decide in your mind that the conditions for the peace that you seek are yours to control. That way you're always free, no matter what the circumstance is. And at the same time, I do find it really helpful to find space for me outside in gardens. I spend a lot of time in gardens. I didn't talk in this book. I'm going to talk about it in much longer form in my next book about the power of gardens and the qualities of gardeners. For me, being in natural spaces like cultivated gardens and hiking, being in the natural space where there's no evidence of human life, it really helps me to have the breath to imagine. And I think that for the entrepreneur, the breath to imagine is how we survive, because the conditions are so challenging that we have to always be imagining best case scenario, alternative futures, what other possibilities might be so that we can persist. So for me, that the rest it's something that I've learned to do wherever I am. And it's a practice that I find in the pleasure I get from being out in the natural world. But that idea of being still, how do we get still? How do we enjoy and not be afraid of being alone? That solitude. And then how do we, in the solitude, find the deep pleasure of being still, which is something, particularly as the descendants of the enslaved, that creates anxiety, I think, for a lot of us, because we have been, our endocrine systems are so used to being pressured
and on the defense.
And we've developed a voice of the overseer in our minds that we are oftentimes driving ourselves in ways that are not conducive to our wellness. And I think part of it is elevating our consciousness to recognize that that's a part of our inheritance, so that we can really act in some radical resistance to that conditioning. Mm-hmm. And that happens within our own apparatus. And I think the highest point of freedom is when you can do it no matter where you are.
Absolutely. I do have one last question, because I know you have a daughter.
Yeah.
She's 16, right? Like creating all of this, because we know as working mothers how difficult it can be to balance all of this ambition, all of this work, and be a decent parent.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you balance that? And how is your daughter, what does she think about this book?
She said she was going to read it when I died.
Oh.
And I think she's an only child. And it's not that I did have her read the Vogue article yesterday, and she was like, Mom, that's really good. And I'm like, thank you for reading it. But I think for her, she's also probably, I know her strategically, she's trying to figure out, I imagine, how to hold on to me. And so for her, I think that this book will be a way for her to engage with me when I'm not with her anymore. And I created it in part for that reason. My next book, which is about gardening, she doesn't know this yet, but it's for her. And I plan on releasing it to the world, but it's a reflection on being a woman in this world and distillations of all of those learnings from that lens to set her up for a lifetime of rest and adventure and joy, no matter what's happening in the world, dealing with the hard things. I think for me, we've been able to do some of this together. You know, when I was volunteering in soup kitchens, she comes with me. When I was serving on council as a councilwoman, she would be in council sessions with me. She would have her own kind of toolkit of things to do to engage her own mind when I was in my world. But she's been at the peripheral in that way. She's always been kind of with me as a working mom. When I built the first Grant Boulevard, the storefront had a loft above it. So if she didn't want to be with people, it was like a living room just for her. So I've tried to work to integrate her in that way. As first it's about communication. When she really needs me to be somewhere, then she just knows to tell me, I really need you to be here. And I'm like, well, I've then heard, and that's what we'll do. And when I tell her I really need you to be flexible in this way, because this is what I need to do, she's learning how to hold respect for that too. So it's been very collaborative, and her middle name is Noor. And so I've really worked and continue to work to preserve her light and to feed her light and hope to position her to be able to be generous with her light as she enters into her own experience with womanhood and with leadership.
Dr. Kimberly McGlonn.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Taryn. Shout out to American Grammar. If you haven't been down here yet, you got to come to American Grammar.
Yeah, it's great.
Best coffee.
Yeah.